Settle into a comfortable position and allow the quiet of the evening to surround you. Tonight's mystery moves gently through rain-washed streets, silent galleries, and rooms filled with old paintings. There is no need to follow every clue. Simply listen, breathe slowly, and let the story carry you into the night. It was during one of those soft November evenings, when London seemed wrapped in a curtain of silver rain, that Sherlock Holmes and I first heard of the strange portrait at Harcourt Gallery. The fire in our sitting room at Baker Street had burned low. Beyond the windows, carriage wheels moved over the wet pavement with a distant, soothing rhythm. Holmes sat in his usual chair. His long fingers rested beneath his chin, and his eyes were half closed. I had learned, however, that this peaceful appearance rarely meant that his mind was idle. At 8:15, Mrs. Hudson entered and announced a visitor. The man who followed her was perhaps 60 years old. He was tall, carefully dressed, and carried a black umbrella with a silver handle. A few drops of rain still clung to the shoulders of his dark coat. "My name is Percival Harcourt," he said. "I am the owner of Harcourt Gallery." Holmes opened his eyes. "The gallery near Russell Square?" "The same." "I saw your announcement in yesterday's newspaper. You intend to sell the portrait of Lady Miriam in grey." Mr. Harcourt looked surprised. "Yes, it is the most valuable painting in my collection, or at least it was until 3 mornings ago." He placed his umbrella beside the door and sat across from us. The painting, he explained, had belonged to his family for nearly 80 years. It was believed to have been painted in 1798 by Augustus Bellamy, one of the most respected portrait artists of his generation. The subject was Lady Miriam Ashcombe, a young widow in a grey dress. She stood beside a table, holding a white handkerchief in her left hand. A silver comb lay on the table. Behind her was an open window overlooking a quiet garden. The painting had remained unchanged for more than a century. Then, on Tuesday morning, the handkerchief appeared in Lady Miriam's right hand. "At first, I thought I had remembered it incorrectly," Mr. Harcourt continued. "But we compared it with an old photograph. There could be no doubt." "And the following morning?" Holmes asked. The window behind her was closed. Holmes leaned slightly forward. "And this morning?" The silver comb had vanished from the table. I must confess that even I felt a small chill at those words. Yet Holmes appeared only interested. "Has the painting been removed from its frame?" "No." "Has anyone entered the gallery during the night?" "That is impossible. Our porter, Mr. Finch, closes the building at 9. He places a numbered wax seal across the main doors. Every seal has been unbroken the following morning." "Are there other entrances?" "A service door and 2 windows. They are secured from the inside. There is no sign that any of them has been opened." "Who works in the gallery?" "Myself, my assistant curator, Mr. Daniel Mercer, our conservator, Miss Lydia Shaw, and Mr. Finch. There are also 2 attendants, but they leave before closing." Holmes looked toward the fire. "Who first noticed the changes?" "Mr. Mercer. He arrives early each morning to inspect the temperature and humidity of the rooms." And the painting is protected by glass. Yes, the glass was added many years ago. Mr. Harcourt hesitated before continuing. There is something else. From his coat pocket, he removed a small envelope. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper. Holmes held it near the lamp. The message contained only one sentence. A portrait may tell the truth when its owner will not. There was no signature. When did this arrive? Holmes asked. Yesterday afternoon. It was delivered by hand, but no one saw who left it. Do you believe someone is attempting to frighten you? I do not know what to believe. Rumors have already begun to spread. If the matter becomes public, the sale may be ruined. Holmes examined the paper, then passed it to me. It seemed ordinary. The handwriting was neat and narrow. There was no watermark that I could see. Why are you selling the portrait? Holmes asked. The gallery requires repairs. The roof, the heating system, and several storage rooms need attention. An American collector has offered a considerable sum. And has the painting's history been thoroughly examined? Mr. Harcourt's expression changed for only a moment. It has always been accepted as the work of Augustus Bellamy. That was not my question. The room became silent except for the quiet sound of the rain. There have been minor uncertainties, Mr. Harcourt admitted, but nothing important. Holmes rose from his chair and walked to the window. Objects do not change without cause, Mr. Harcourt. Paintings are especially patient objects. If one appears to move, disappear, or speak, we must first ask whose hand is helping it. You will investigate. We shall visit the gallery tomorrow morning. Our visitor thanked Holmes and prepared to leave. As he reached the door, Holmes spoke again. One final question. After the last visitor leaves, who remains alone with the portrait? Mr. Harcourt considered this. Mr. Mercer makes his final inspection. He records the humidity in each room. Afterward, Mr. Finch seals the doors. How much time passes between the inspection and the sealing? Perhaps 10 minutes. Holmes nodded. When Mr. Harcourt had gone, I turned toward my friend. You do not believe these changes occur during the night. My dear Watson, we know only that they are discovered in the morning. That is quite a different thing. He returned to the table and studied the anonymous message once more. Tomorrow, we shall look at the woman in gray. I suspect she has been waiting a very long time for someone to look at her properly. Outside, the rain continued to fall over Baker Street. The fire settled quietly in the grate, and the unanswered mystery remained with us through the night. The rain had stopped by the following morning, though the sky remained pale and gray. Harcourt Gallery stood in a narrow street near Russell Square. It was an elegant building of dark brick, with tall windows and 4 stone steps leading to its entrance. Mr. Harcourt was waiting for us inside. The gallery was not yet open to the public. Our footsteps echoed softly as he led us through a series of quiet rooms. Landscapes, portraits, and peaceful country scenes covered the walls. The portrait of Lady Miriam in grey hung alone at the center of the final room. It was a beautiful painting. Lady Miriam stood with a calm expression, her dark hair gathered above her neck. Her grey dress seemed almost silver where the painted daylight touched it. As Mr. Harcourt had described, the white handkerchief was now in her right hand. The window behind her was closed, and the silver comb was no longer on the table. Holmes did not approach the picture immediately. He first walked around the room. He examined the floor, the ceiling, the position of the gas lamps, and the distance between the painting and the nearest window. Only then did he stand before the portrait. For several minutes, he said nothing. He viewed the painting from the left, then from the right. He lowered himself until his eyes were level with Lady Miriam's hands. "Watson," he said, "stand where I am standing. Look at the edge of the handkerchief." I did as he asked. "Now move 2 steps to the left." The white edge appeared to shift slightly against the woman's fingers. "It moves," I said. "The handkerchief does not move. Its position in relation to the painted hand changes." He breathed gently upon the protective glass. For a moment, a faint shape appeared in the mist before fading away. Holmes smiled. Mr. Harcourt watched him with growing curiosity. "What does that mean?" "It means we are looking at 2 different surfaces." Holmes took out his magnifying lens. Near the bottom of the frame, he found a thin grey mark. Below it, on the wooden floor, lay a small amount of pale powder. He touched it with 1 finger, but did not yet explain its importance. At that moment, 3 members of the gallery staff entered. The first was Miss Lydia Shaw, the conservator. She was a quiet woman in her 40s, with observant brown eyes. A pair of small spectacles rested on a cord around her neck. Beside her stood Mr. Finch, the elderly porter. His blue uniform was carefully brushed, and a heavy ring of keys hung from his belt. The last man was Daniel Mercer, the assistant curator. Mercer was about 30 years old. He had a thoughtful face and spoke in a calm, measured voice. He carried a leather record book beneath one arm. "You discovered each alteration?" Holmes asked him. "Yes, I inspect this room every morning." "At what time?" "Shortly after 8. "And you are also the final person to inspect it in the evening?" "That is correct." Holmes glanced at the leather book. "You record the temperature." "The temperature and humidity. Old paintings are sensitive to both." "Did you notice anything unusual before the first change?" Mercer looked toward the portrait. "No. Although the room had become slightly more humid because of the rain." Miss Shaw stepped closer to the painting. "I examined the surface after the handkerchief changed," she said. "I could find no damage to the original paint." "You examined the canvas itself?" Holmes asked. "Only through the glass. Mr. Harcourt did not wish the frame to be disturbed before the sale. Holmes looked briefly at the gallery owner. Mr. Harcourt seemed uncomfortable. Removing the glass might reduce confidence in the painting's condition, he explained. Holmes returned his attention to Miss Shaw. What substance would leave a pale powder after being used on glass? Several substances might. Finely ground pumice, perhaps. A restorer sometimes uses it to reduce an unwanted shine. And what might be used to place a temporary color upon glass? Watercolor mixed with gum arabic. It would dry quickly and could later be removed. Mr. Harcourt stared at her. Are you saying someone painted these changes on the glass? I am only answering Mr. Holmes's question. Holmes asked Mr. Finch to describe the closing procedure. Every evening, the visitors left at 8. The attendants checked the public rooms and departed. Mercer then completed his final environmental inspection. At approximately 9, Finch locked the service entrance from inside. He and Mercer left through the main doors. Finch placed a fresh wax seal across them and wrote the seal's number in a separate book. "And you remain in the building overnight?" Holmes asked. "No, sir. The building is empty." "Could anyone return without disturbing the seal?" "Not through any door or window known to me." Holmes walked to the small brass plate beneath the portrait. It read, "Portrait of Lady Miriam Ashcombe, 1798. Augustus Bellamy." "Has the attribution ever been questioned?" he asked. Miss Shaw and Mercer exchanged a glance. Mr. Harcourt answered first. "There is no signature visible on the painting. However, it was listed as a Bellamy when my grandfather purchased it." "Listed by whom?" "A dealer named Tobias Green." "Was Green considered reliable?" Mr. Harcourt gave a quiet sigh. "Not always." Mercer opened his leather book. "There is an earlier catalogue entry," he said. "It describes the work only as Portrait of a Lady. No artist is named." "And when did Bellamy's name first appear?" "Several years after the painting was completed." Mr. Harcourt's voice became firm. "That uncertainty has nothing to do with what is happening now." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "it may have everything to do with it." He asked to see the old catalogues, the sale records, and any letters connected with the portrait. Mercer agreed to bring them from the archive. As he walked away, Holmes watched him closely. Miss Shaw then allowed Holmes to examine several cleaning materials used in the conservation room. He smelled each small bottle and inspected the brushes, cloths, and trays. Nothing appeared to be missing. Before we left the portrait room, Holmes paused beside the frame once again. Set into the dark wood were 8 small brass screws. 7 were covered with an even layer of old wax and dust. The 8th was clean around its edge. "Someone has loosened this screw recently," I whispered. "Yes." "Then the frame has been opened." "Partly opened," Holmes replied. but not necessarily during the night. He straightened and addressed Mr. Harcourt. I should like everyone to repeat the usual closing procedure this evening. You intend to remain in the gallery only until the doors are sealed. Mr. Harcourt frowned. But the portrait changes overnight. So everyone keeps telling me, said Holmes. Tonight, Watson and I shall pay closer attention to the minutes before the night begins. We returned to Harcourt Gallery shortly before 8 that evening. The final visitors moved quietly through the rooms while rain began tapping against the tall windows. The gas lamps cast warm circles of light across the polished floors. Holmes appeared relaxed. He spoke little and spent most of the hour studying an old catalogue that Mercer had brought from the archive. I noticed that several pages referred to Augustus Bellamy. Yet the portrait of Lady Miriam was absent from the earliest lists of his work. A few minutes before closing, Holmes gathered us in front of the painting. The handkerchief remained in Lady Miriam's right hand. The window was closed. The silver comb was absent. A small red rose was still painted near the edge of the table. Holmes asked each of us to observe it carefully. Mr. Harcourt was impatient. What importance can a rose have? Perhaps none, Holmes said, but it is useful to agree upon what we see. At 8, Mr. Finch politely guided the last visitors toward the entrance. The two attendants inspected the public rooms and left. Miss Shaw returned to the conservation room to put away her instruments. Mr. Harcourt waited in his office. Mercer began his final inspection. He carried his leather record book from room to room. At each doorway, he paused beside a small measuring instrument and wrote down the figures. When he reached the portrait room, he entered alone. Holmes stood with me in the neighboring gallery. We could hear only the faint movement of Mercer's shoes and the quiet turn of a page. 4 minutes later, he emerged. The inspection is complete, he said. Holmes immediately entered the room. We followed. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Lady Miriam remained beside the table, calm and still. Then Holmes pointed toward the lower corner of the portrait. The red rose had disappeared. Mr. Harcourt stepped forward in astonishment. That was there 10 minutes ago. Indeed, Holmes replied, and the doors have not yet been sealed. The room became very quiet. Mercer's face had lost some of its color, though his voice remained steady. Are you accusing me? I am explaining the importance of time, Holmes said. The previous alterations were discovered in the morning. Everyone therefore assumed they occurred during the night. But no one carefully inspected the picture between your final visit and the sealing of the doors. Mr. Finch looked troubled. I always check the locks, sir. I did not study the paintings. You did your duty perfectly. The seals were never broken because no one needed to return. Holmes stepped close to the portrait. The original image has not been altered. The changes are painted upon the protective glass. He asked us to move from side to side. Once again, the edge of the handkerchief appeared to shift against the painted fingers. The small distance between the glass and the canvas produces this movement, he continued. A detail painted directly upon the canvas would remain in its proper position. Miss Shaw examined the glass with her spectacles. There is a thin grey wash over the rose, she said. It is almost perfectly matched to the table. Watercolor, gum arabic, and a small amount of finely ground pumice, Holmes said. The pumice removes the shine. Without it, the added paint would reflect the lamps differently from the surface behind it. He turned toward Mercer. The pale powder beneath the frame came from your work. The fresh wax concealed the screw you loosened to raise the lower edge of the glass. You did not remove the entire frame. You needed only enough space for a narrow brush. Mercer said nothing. Holmes held out his hand. Your record book, please. For a moment, I thought the young man might refuse. Then he slowly passed it to Holmes. The pages contained neat columns of numbers. Holmes turned to the back, where several sheets of blotting paper had been pressed between the cover and the final page. Faint traces of white, gray, red, and silver covered the paper. You carried no painting case, Holmes said. That would have attracted attention. A flat brush, a small piece of damp cloth, and a few prepared colors could easily be wrapped in this paper. Mr. Harcourt's anger rose. You have been damaging my painting. No, Mercer said at last. I never touched the canvas. Everything I added can be removed. You created this ridiculous mystery and placed the sale in danger. The sale should never take place. Mercer's words were quiet, but there was determination in them. Mr. Harcourt stared at him. Holmes closed the record book. Now we have reached the more interesting question. You did not create these changes merely to frighten Mr. Harcourt. Each alteration has a specific meaning. Mercer looked at Holmes with surprise. The handkerchief moved from left to right, Holmes continued. The window was closed. The silver comb was removed. Tonight the rose disappeared. Those details were not chosen at random. No, Mercer admitted. Then perhaps it is time to tell us why you chose them. Mercer walked toward Lady Miriam's portrait. My grandmother left me a box of family letters, he said. Most were ordinary. A few were written by a woman named Eliza Vane. Miss Shaw looked up sharply. I have heard that name, she said. She worked in Bellamy's studio. She did more than work there, Mercer replied. She painted this portrait. Mr. Harcourt shook his head. That is impossible. Mercer opened the old catalogue Holmes had been reading. Eliza was my grandmother's great-grandmother. Her letters describe Lady Miriam's portrait in detail. She wrote that the handkerchief should be moved to the right hand. She closed the window in the background. She removed a silver comb because it distracted from the sitter's face. Later, she decided the red rose was too bright. He looked at the altered picture. I recreated those corrections one by one. You were trying to make the portrait match the letters, I said. Yes. I showed the letters to Mr. Harcourt 6 months ago. He refused to examine them. They have never been authenticated, Harcourt replied, and the Bellamy name gives the painting its value. That is precisely why you refused. Holmes raised one hand, ending the argument. A confession explains the changing portrait, he said. It does not yet prove who painted the original. He turned toward Miss Shaw. Can the added color be safely removed from the glass? Very easily. And can a small area of old overpaint on the canvas be examined without damage? If we choose the area carefully. Mercer reached inside his coat and removed a folded letter. There is a final line, he said. Eliza wrote that Bellamy covered her name beneath the lowest fold of the gray dress. Holmes accepted the letter but did not unfold it immediately. Then we shall allow the painting itself to answer. The gas lamps burned steadily above us. Outside, rain moved softly across the glass roof. For the first time since we had entered the gallery, no one looked at the disappearing objects. All our attention rested upon the quiet grey fold at the bottom of Lady Miriam's dress. Miss Shaw prepared a work table beneath the portrait. Her movements were slow and careful. She first removed the temporary color from the protective glass. The white handkerchief returned to Lady Miriam's left hand. The window opened once more. The silver comb and the red rose quietly reappeared. The strange changes had vanished within minutes. The glass was then lifted from the frame. Holmes studied the lowest fold of the painted grey dress. Near the left edge, the color was slightly warmer than the surrounding area. Miss Shaw touched it gently with the soft cloth and a carefully chosen solution. No one spoke. A thin layer of darker paint slowly began to dissolve. Beneath it, a small curved line appeared. Then another. After several minutes, 2 faded letters could be seen. E.V. Mercer closed his eyes briefly. Eliza Vane, he whispered. Mr. Harcourt stood with his hands behind his back. His earlier anger had given way to silence. Initials alone are not proof, he said at last. No, Holmes agreed, but they are one part of a larger pattern. We moved to the gallery office, where the family letters were placed beneath a bright lamp. Holmes arranged them by date. He examined their ink, the folds in the paper, and the faint watermarks visible when each page was held toward the light. These letters were written over several months in 1798, he explained. The paper came from a mill near Bath. The same watermark appears on letters held in 2 public collections from that period. He placed one letter beside an early catalogue. The ink has aged naturally. It has entered the paper fibers rather than resting upon them. The folds are old, and the dust along them has gathered over many years. Mr. Mercer could not have produced these documents recently. Miss Shaw read several passages aloud. Eliza described mixing a grey from ivory black, lead white, and a small amount of blue. She mentioned changing the shape of Lady Miriam's sleeve and softening the garden beyond the window. Miss Shaw compared these descriptions with the painting. "The pigment mixture is unusual," she said, "but it matches what I can see in the dress." Another letter described a narrow gold line beneath the silver comb. The line was nearly invisible, unless the picture was viewed from below. Holmes returned to the gallery and lowered himself before the portrait. There it was. A thin golden mark rested beneath the comb. "It was painted over during the final work," Holmes said. "Only the person who created the earlier layer would be likely to mention it." The final letter was more personal. Eliza wrote that Augustus Bellamy had promised to present her as the painter's assistant. Instead, he had placed his own name on the payment record and taken credit for the completed portrait. She had protested, but her position was weak. Bellamy owned the studio. The patrons knew his name, not hers. "So the painting was never signed by Bellamy," I said. "Because he did not paint it," Holmes replied. "The attribution appeared years later, when memory had become uncertain and Bellamy's name had become valuable." Mr. Harcourt sat heavily in a chair. "My grandfather purchased it as a Bellamy." "Your grandfather may have believed that attribution," Holmes said. "The original mistake need not have been his." "And what am I expected to do now? Tell the truth?" The answer was simple, but Holmes spoke without judgment. Mr. Harcourt looked toward Mercer. "You could have brought these letters to an independent expert." "I tried," Mercer said. "No one would examine the paintings without your permission. Once you announced the sale, I feared it would disappear into a private collection. So you created a ghost story." "I created a question that could not be ignored." Holmes stood beside the fire. "Your purpose may have been honorable, Mr. Mercer, but your method was deceptive. You also risked damaging a valuable work. Truth does not become stronger when it is carried by a lie." Mercer lowered his eyes. "I understand." Mr. Harcourt remained silent for a long time. At last, he crossed the room and stood before the portrait. Lady Miriam now appeared as she had before the mystery began. Her handkerchief rested in her left hand. The garden window was open, and the comb and rose had returned to the table. Yet the painting no longer seemed quite the same. We knew another person now stood behind its creation. Eliza Vane was not visible in the picture, but her choices remained in every color and every careful line. "The sale will be postponed," Mr. Harcourt said. "Miss Shaw will prepare a complete examination. The letters and the painting will be shown to independent historians." Mercer looked up. "And if they agree, the name beneath the portrait will be changed." Several weeks later, a short announcement appeared in the newspapers. The portrait of Lady Miriam in grey would remain at Harcourt Gallery. It was now described as the work of Eliza Vane, formerly attributed to Augustus Bellamy. Mr. Harcourt also announced a small exhibition about women artists whose work had been overlooked or incorrectly credited. Daniel Mercer kept his position, though he was no longer permitted to carry painting materials in his record book. Miss Shaw supervised the complete removal of every temporary mark. The portrait had suffered no lasting harm. On the evening the announcement appeared, Holmes and I sat once more beside the fire at Baker Street. I had been considering the case. The unbroken seals were convincing, I said. I believed the changes had to occur after the gallery was closed. That was the central mistake, Holmes replied. A strong fact can lead us in the wrong direction when we place it beside an unproven assumption. The seals proved only that no one entered during the night. Exactly. They did not prove that the picture remained unchanged before the doors were sealed. And you suspected Mercer from the beginning. I suspected the person who controlled both moments. He was the last to inspect the portrait each evening, and the first to examine it each morning. But suspicion is not proof. He leaned back in his chair. The shifting edge of the handkerchief showed that the new image rested upon the glass. The pale pumice dulled the shine of the temporary paint. The loosened screw allowed access beneath the frame, and Mercer's record book carried the colors. What about the anonymous message? Written by Mercer, of course. He wanted Mr. Harcourt to think about the truth hidden behind the accepted name. Holmes looked thoughtfully into the fire. A frame can surround a masterpiece, Watson. It can also surround a mistake. People often continue believing the words written beneath an object long after they have stopped examining the object itself. Outside, the London streets had grown still. The rain had ended, leaving the pavement dark and smooth beneath the lamps. A distant carriage passed and slowly faded into silence. I thought of Eliza Vane, working quietly in Bellamy's studio many years before. She could not have known that her initials would one day return to the light, or that the choices described in her private letters would finally speak for her. The portrait had never truly changed. Only the way in which we understood it had changed. Holmes reached for the newspaper, and the fire gave a soft, quiet sound as another piece of wood settled into the grate. The mystery was finished. Baker Street returned to its familiar calm, while the sleeping city rested beneath the deep and gentle night.